and then share screen. Okay, now I will let them in.
Welcome, everyone.
Hi there. I don't seem to be on video.
If you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a start video button.
There you go. See, you can tell I'm first to this. New to this.
Not at all.
How did you get the cherry blossoms, people?
These ones are right outside of where I live, not too far, but the wind
Oh, you can
is taking away.
recognize it from here.
Yeah. I've got my clean bookcase behind me.
I love the vase of flowers on top.
It's very pretty.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello, Michael. Good morning, or whatever the time of day is, wherever you're dialing in from, everyone.
Dinner time. Happy International Haiku Poetry Day.
It is.
I think maybe we'll just give it a few more minutes because it's 10 o'clock now, but we had about 90 people wanting to join us today. So maybe if we give it another minute or so.
I'm here in New Westminster, Cape Land. Thanks, Bonnie, for inviting me. Good morning. I'm having breakfast, so I won't always treat you to that.
If some of you want to rename yourselves, so it's not just your first name or some other name, you can click to display the participant list near the bottom, and then hover over your name in the list, click more, and then you should see a rename option. And that way we'll better know who each of you are. So that advice applies to anyone whose just first name is listed, or a device name, or something else.
How can I put myself in color? I'm in black and white. That doesn't suit me.
No,
Um,
you're in color.
we see you in color.
Oh, okay. All right then.
It is starting to slow down now. So Michael, should we get started and I can continue letting people in as they join us?
Yes, let's mute everyone except you and me. And let's get started.
The welcome slide will disappear. Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to How to Haiku with Michael Dylan Welch, presented by our Haiku Invitational sponsor, Leith Wheeler Investment Council Limited. My name is Karina. I am with the Vancouver Cherry Blossom Festival, presented by Coromandel Properties. If you weren't already aware, this year we have a variety of virtual programming that is still ongoing, including this workshop, the Haiku Invitational, a photo contest, an elementary educational video for all ages, guided tree talks and walks, and more. So please check out vcbf.ca after this workshop for more details. A few reminders for today. When you are not speaking, please keep yourself on mute. We will be using the chat box as you guys already are, so please keep an eye on this space. Michael will be asking for volunteers to read out poems, so please feel free to jump in and volunteer when you receive that prompt. Before we begin, I would like to share a message from the sponsor here.
Hi there, I'm Mike Wahlberg, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this Vancouver Cherry Blossom Festival Haiku Invitational workshop. I work with Leith Wheeler Investment Council. We're based here in Vancouver, and we manage money for individuals and their families, as well as larger organizations like pensions, foundations, endowments, and Indigenous communities across Canada. We're thrilled to return this year as sponsor of the Haiku Invitational. This is marking well over 10 years of our involvement with this great festival. I hope you have a wonderful session today with Michael Dylan Welch, and then later on you manage to find a sunny patio with some cherry blossoms, as I have. Enjoy.
So now let me introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Michael Dylan Welch. Michael is joining us from Sammamish, Washington, and he has been helping the festival on the Haiku Committee for at least the last 10 to 12 years or so, or maybe even longer than that. Michael is the founder of the National Haiku Writing Month and also the co-founders of the American Haiku Archives and the Haiku North American Conference. So Michael, I will leave the rest of the workshop to you.
Thank you very much, Karina, and welcome everyone. Glad to have you all here. I've been seeing in the chat, several of you have been saying where you're from, and it's great to have you. I know we have people from around the world, mostly North America. Glad you could be here. If you're braving a different time zone, thank you for doing that. I know it's hard to keep track of the time zones, but I think with our Zoom culture in the last year or so, we're getting more and more used to that. And yeah, it's been a year since a year ago, we did this workshop for the Haiku Invitational on Zoom. And it seemed such a novelty a year ago, and now it's so routine. And I'm looking forward to the day next year when we can have this sort of workshop in person. But of course, for those of you from a great distance, that won't be possible. So there is a definite benefit to Zoom here today. I'm curious to know how many of you have ever been in one of my haiku workshops before, if you want to raise your hand. Okay, one or two. So if you've been in my workshops before, you will be hearing some of the same things. Excuse me. And for any of you who are perhaps a little more experienced with haiku, if I ask a question, you might know the answer pretty easily, but perhaps stand back a little bit and let some of the new folks answer some of the questions. But if it goes silent for too long, feel free to pipe up if you have an answer or an observation. And I do want this to be interactive. Keep yourself muted, but just learn how to quickly unmute and chime in. And later we will be having the opportunity to take turns reading some poems aloud. And it'll just be a bit cacophonous, but we'll figure it out and take turns. Perhaps the way we can do that is if you could raise your hand and then I'll call on you to read the poem. That might be the simplest way to do it. So let me start my screen sharing here. So I'm calling this Haiku Targets. We could call it How to Haiku, many other names we could give it. I like to think of haiku as having targets rather than rules. Rules can feel straining and arbitrary and so on, whereas targets are opportunities. So there are different things that you have the option to aim at when you're writing haiku, and we'll be exploring that today. And I think it will be for those of you who are new to this, thinking in terms of targets, I hope it's liberating and inspiring. And you may have heard rules for haiku already. We'll be talking about some of those and also having some time to write. So to begin with, here's a poem that I've seen on a t-shirt. Maybe you have too. I recall seeing this more than a dozen years ago, first time. Haikus are easy, but sometimes they don't make sense. Refrigerator. So you can unmute if you like and answer this question if somebody wants to answer this. Is this a haiku?
Yes.
And why would you say it's a haiku?
575.
Okay. Oops. Anyone else? Is this a haiku?
It's send you, more like a send you.
Okay, for those of you unfamiliar with that term, SENRYU is the word Jackie used. It's like haiku, but tends to be more humorous, more about poking fun at humans and less focused on nature or the seasons. So that's one way to interpret this poem. Any other comments on it?
I liked the unexpected end last line refrigerator. I thought that was really pretty nice. That
Okay.
to me looks like a haiku.
Okay. Anyone else?
Jalika,
Sorry, say again.
I would like to try.
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm French Canadian. Maybe it would be different, but I don't think it's an haiku because it doesn't make sense to me and it doesn't touch me. Haiku always touch me, and this one, well, it leave me cold.
Okay. Did you laugh?
A little, but
Okay.
not much.
Okay. So if you laughed a little, I would suggest that it did touch you.
Oh wait, yeah, in a sense, I can understand.
So my response to this poem is that it's funny, it's amusing, but it's not a haiku. Because what it really is a comment about haiku. Also, the word haiku is both singular and plural, so there's no need to say haikus. So haiku are easy, would be correct. But sometimes they don't make sense. This is a comment, a statement about haiku, and it's departing from what a haiku is trying to do. So
yes.
in that sense, it is it's not touching you. It's explaining something to you. It's not something you can feel or experience. But the one thing the poem gets right is the word refrigerator. And of course, it's funny in this context, but it also demonstrates a key thing about haiku is that a haiku is usually in two parts, and then there's a shift in some place in the poem. And in this case, the shift is in the last line. And the reason the t-shirt says sometimes haiku don't make sense is because of this shift. I like to call it the refrigerator effect after this poem, where something unexpected or surprising or shifting in the poem takes us away from the other part of the poem. And sometimes the refrigerator effect can happen in the first line with a shift to the second and third lines. But there's usually these two parts and they have sort of an energy together. And in this case, it's for humorous effect. But I would say this is not haiku. And counting syllables isn't what makes it a haiku or not, as we'll see. We'll get into that. So as we go through our poems today, we'll be reading and sharing and discussing some. We will see this refrigerator effect in poems that are to come. So here's what I hope to accomplish today, and we may not get to the end of this. What's a haiku anyway? We'll build a list of key haiku targets, and then we'll talk a bit about where haiku came from and some of the Japanese antecedents, including some of the great masters of Japan and some of their haiku. We'll have a writing exercise, and if there's time, we'll share our haiku. And if there's really lots of time, I'll briefly talk about other haiku-related arts. And of course, all of this is to encourage you to enter the Vancouver Cherry Blossom Festival's Haiku Invitational. And if you go to vcbf.ca and look for the haiku content, you will find a link to enter 1 or 2 haiku on the theme of cherry blossoms. And you have until June 1, so there's quite a bit of time. But I hope you can get out in your cherry blossoms if you've got some near you where you live, and record some experiences and some of your impressions of that, feelings about in reaction to the experience. But we'll get back to the question of how to express feelings in haiku later. So any questions before we launch into this? Feel free to unmute and just start talking if you happen to have a question about what we're doing. Okay, let's continue then. So what I want you to do, normally I have a handout, it says see handout, so I ignore that bit. But you can listen to the poems that'll be projected on screen. And I want you to notice how each poem makes you feel. And as we go through these, consider which poems you like the most or which ones puzzle you. You might even dislike them. That's fine too. But it's puzzle, or if you're puzzled by it or it's confusing for some reason, just think about that. But also ones you like the most. So keep both of those in mind. And this is the key part. I want you to think of common characteristics in the poems that follow. So what are some things that all these poems have in common? And you'll have an opportunity to share your observations about that after we go through some of these poems. So could someone please read this for us? As it turns out, while I'm presenting, I'm not able to see everyone's hands raised, so that won't work after all. But if you'd just like to read a poem, just start, and if 2 or more of you start at once, we'll figure it out. Someone want to read this, please, with the name as well.
Telephone rings only once. Autumn rain.
Okay, and how does that make you feel?
Makes a question mark in my brain.
Okay.
For me, yes, for me it means melancholia and nostalgia, which come with the autumn.
Okay.
And it makes me feel that way.
So melancholy for sure.
Yeah.
Why do any of you think the phone rings only once?
Well, because there's loneliness in that thing. The feeling of loneliness rings only once, so it for me it means that I don't know.
So
one feels one feels lonely, the telephone doesn't ring too often, not often enough. So there's a feeling of loneliness. Well, for me, it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's.
So I agree. It creates a feeling of loneliness and miscommunication. And we can speculate why the telephone rang only once. It could be wrong number, or power failure, or somebody chickened out. Sandra, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I thought the phone rang only once because we were expecting that call. Like something's, you know, suspense, something is happening somewhere and we're expecting a call, and then autumn rain, maybe because it's bringing bad news.
Yeah, it could be that you've answered the phone, but for me, I see it as not necessarily having answered the call. Anyone else, if you raised your hand, go ahead and share your thoughts. Diana?
So I think like the telephone tells about loneliness. So like, here autumn is like the lonely time of the year. So like in 1 year, with telephone rings only once, it's like autumn.
Okay, so there you can also see the what I call the refrigerator effect, is that shift in the last line, and it also creates a sort of mystery. What does autumn rain have to do with the telephone ringing only once? And that mystery and the shift between those two parts creates a sort of question. It asks, what does this have to do with that? And it creates a space where you can begin to answer that question for yourself. A feeling, it creates a feeling. It doesn't tell you what to feel, but it creates a feeling. And in this case, you know, this was written before caller ID and cell phones and so on. It's probably at least 30 years old. So this, but that aside, you know, if your cell phone rang only once, sure, you could probably look up where the number was and see if you recognize it or whatever. But it's still a denied communication, and that creates what creates the feeling of loneliness. And autumn is echoes that. It's a lonely season. Spring would have the wrong tone, and rain is sort of melancholy as well. So those two elements are chosen very carefully to go with the experience of the telephone ringing only once. And I also imagine that being aware of the sound of the phone makes the poet aware of the sound of the rain too. So both of those things are going on in the poem. So we spent a lot of time in this poem because it's a good illustration of how a lot of haiku work, especially with that refrigerator effect. We'll spend less time on some of the future poems, but if somebody could read this one, go ahead.
Old retriever, he opens one eye at the tossed stick. By
And
Gary
how does
Gary.
this, yes, thank you. How does this make you feel? Anyone?
Kind of sad. Kind of sad because the old dog doesn't really want to go and fetch the stick. Just takes a look at it and goes back to sleep. So kind of sad.
Any other?
I was kind of concerned about the fact that the haiku didn't really have a shift. That it's kind of pretty straightforward.
So the he restates the old retriever. So basically what this poem is saying is old retriever opens one eye at the tossed stick. So it's sort of a one phrase thing that's slightly broken up with the he construction. So in this case, it doesn't have quite the same refrigerator effect structure. You're right about that. but not every haiku has to have that. It's an effective technique, but it doesn't have to have that. And it still has because of the he construction, it still has at least a grammatical pause. We see the old retriever, and then we see him opening one eye at the toss stick. Something I like about this is that it still notices. It may not chase after the stick like a puppy, but it still notices. It's still a retriever. And in this case, it's happy to just sort of not chase after it this time. And that's sort of,
for me, it's
sort of an indication of its age. And that's where a feeling of sadness comes from, I think.
I thought it reminds me of lazy summer days. I can picture this dog and somebody sitting, you've got the cherry blossoms behind you, sitting in a park under the cherry blossoms. And the dog's like, yeah, no, leave me alone. I'm having a lovely time just relaxing.
Yes. So in that case, in that sense, it's a peaceful poem and not necessarily sad. It's relaxed.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I guess I'm not paying attention to how syllables are supposed to be. Would it be possible to say he opens one eye at the toss stick, old retriever?
You could rearrange the poem that way, yeah.
Would it still be properly a haiku?
I think that wouldn't matter which order it was in. It would still be a haiku, I would say. Obviously, this is how the poet chose to present it.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry. So if you had it the other way around, he opens one eye at the toss stick, you might begin to think that he is a human. And by putting old retriever first, we immediately get rid of that idea, which is helpful, I think. So that's why I would think it's slightly better to have old retriever first, so that we're not thinking human and then having to fix that perception.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Okay, for me, it talks about aging, and it touched me that it's written, he opens one eye, not both of them. You know, it would be tiring to open two eyes. So he takes just one eye, and then the toss stick, for me, represent something else it's old too. It's an old stick, you know. Often the stick that we are tossing are old, all things that we found on the beach. I don't know. It's going all together.
So, yeah.
Hi.
All the details work well, I think. Sorry, there was somebody else. You had a comment?
Oh yeah, hi, this is Mike from Minnesota. I actually think it's kind of a happy haiku because the wise old retriever knows that toss sticks are not what he has to run after.
He's been around the block a few times. You get that feeling. So in the chat, there's been a comment about the indents. And if we back up here, looking at this one, there is an indent in the third line. And in a way, this stands as a replacement for punctuation to indicate the pause or the cut in the poem between its two parts. Whereas in this one, there's sort of the indents may not have the same effect because we do have the semicolon there to indicate a cut or pause, but there's sort of a progression, a feeling of movement because of those indents. Whereas other haiku are all flush left. And this is, flush left is default in English, but if you do indent part of the poem, it can have a slight visual effect that I think is an extra tool you can use as part of the way you write haiku. Let me move on to the next poem. This also has that same sort of movement of indenting subsequent lines. Somebody please read this one you haven't read before.
Hi there. A bitter morning, sparrows sitting together without any necks.
So how does this poem make you feel?
Makes me feel cold.
Yes.
Sounds like our land up here.
Where?
Fort St. John. We still have snow.
Wow. So we get the sense of the winter time of year, so there's a seasonal context for this. Something I like about this is it's not just sparrows without necks. You know, you can see that hunched feeling and their feathers kind of fluffed up around their necks and so on, so you can't see their necks. It's not just that, but they're sitting together, which is a nice detail. They're together for warmth as well. So this must be a particularly bitter morning, cold morning. This poem, by the way, won grand prize in the 1964 Japan Airlines International Haiku Contest. And how many words are there? 9 words here. These 9 words won the author a free trip to Japan.
Wow.
It's a pretty good prize per word, I'd say. James Hackett has passed away now, but for many years he lived near me when I lived in California, and I visited him at his house. And he also later moved to the town of Haiku on Maui. I don't know if we've ever been there, but I'd like to go visit the Haiku Library and the Haiku Police Department and Haiku Fire Station and see "Welcome to Haiku" signs, assuming they have them there. Any other comments on this poem?
I just have a question, a technical question, Michael. I
Yes.
noticed sometimes it begins with a capitalized first letter and sometimes with small. Is there a tradition that one should follow regarding that?
Good question, and good for noticing that. Let me back up here. Obviously, this one began with a capital, but this one did not. And my perspective on this is, excuse me, I have allergies this morning. Usually a haiku is like a fragment. It's not a complete sentence. And by starting with a lowercase letter, it sort of announces we're not about to read a regular sentence. You're going to read something that's poetic and fragmentary. The telephone rings only once. That is actually a complete sentence. But when you put it together with autumn rain, that is a fragment. So the effect of the entire thing is more fragmentary. So many poets avoid starting with a capital letter and avoid ending with a period. One of the reasons for that, in addition to announcing this is not a sentence, etc., is that it's open-ended. Sort of like it's open at the beginning and open at the end. And yet here's this moment of time in the middle that's trying to suggest what happened beforehand and what might happen after. And in this case, the telephone rings only once. Well, you could imagine before this, somebody was maybe sitting in their living room. Maybe they were reading a book or playing solitaire, who knows what. I see a person alone. We can add our pictures to the image, but a lot of that is going on before the telephone rings only once. And then you're dropped into the scene. The telephone rings only once, and then the person becomes aware of the autumn rain. But it doesn't really end there, because you can imagine the person standing up from their chair in the living room and maybe standing at the window and looking at the autumn rain and maybe wondering who called. If they have caller ID, maybe they'd go and check that. I don't know. Or maybe they would think of a friend that they were expecting a call from and maybe call them back. You can engage with the moment in many ways. And it's this idea of the pinpoint of the haiku suggests what's before and after. That's a key thing with haiku. And one way it can do that is by lowercasing the beginning and not having punctuation at the end, or at least that's a theory. But here, I know Gary Gay, he happens to choose to start all of his haiku with a capital letter. That's his personal style. So it's a choice. And I think that was the case with this poem by James Hackett. This poem actually appeared in an earlier version in 1963, in the very first English language haiku journal called American Haiku. And I believe in that version, it started with a lowercase letter. And it also had, it was fewer words. I think the wording was bitter morning, sparrows sitting without necks. So he entered the longer version for the content.
One more little tiny question. On the retriever, I hear everybody say it has to be 5 syllables. An old retriever, I can't get past 4. So what am I missing?
So, okay, this poem, A Bitter Morning, this one is 575. This one is not.
That's okay?
It's okay. And this one is not. So let's talk about syllables for a second. How many syllables in the word haiku?
2.
2. It's not a trick question. In Japan, however, it's 3. Haiku.
Oh.
What they say is actually hike. They swallow the oo at the end. Even though they say hike, I've written a hike, it actually counts as 3 sounds. And I mean sounds, not syllables, because a fundamental misunderstanding of haiku is that it's a 575 syllable poem. No, it's actually not. In Japan, they're counting sounds. That's why the word Tokyo, for example, you might say it as Tokyo. In Japan, they will say Tokyo, which might be 2, sounds like 2. It's actually 4, because they're counting to-o, kyo-o. And the word sign, for example, we would count as 1 syllable. But when the Japanese say it, they say saya-n. It counts as 3 sounds. And the N sound at the end of a word counts as a separate sound. So what they're counting is very different from what we're counting as syllables. And there was a book of sports haiku published in Japan last year, supposedly in time for the Olympics, which haven't happened yet. And in the introduction, the editor, who lives in Japan, she wrote that if you write 575 syllables, if you write 17 syllables in English, that's often enough for 2 haiku in Japanese. And basic weight or heft of a haiku in Japanese is actually much smaller than the weight that you would get from 17 syllables. And to further illustrate this misunderstanding, even though we've all been taught that way, and I was taught that way, English has the word Joe. And I don't mean the name Joe, which is sort of elongated, but a short clipped version of that word, Joe. I mean, we have that sound, not necessarily that word, Joe. All Japanese sounds are like that, either a vowel or a vowel with a consonant. And every consonant is pronounced with a vowel, with very rare exceptions. So they will have words like hototogisu or koku, and their words will have generally more syllables or sounds compared to the English equivalents, or the same, but on average more. But we have the sound jo, but we can elongate that sound and say joy, and watch what happens with the mouth. Joy. You have that change, that sort of change of sound. You've already left behind all Japanese words, all of them. Yet the word joy is still 1 syllable. But we can also say joys, still 1 syllable, but more sounds. Or we can make, instead of a fricative, it's called a fricative, it's z sound. We can make it non-fricative, which I think is Joyce. Joy, Joyce, the name Joyce. So we can go from jo, to joy, joys, Joyce, or we could put a T on the end and it's joiced, still 1 syllable, and we're a long way from Japanese sounds. Or we can go even further and make it plural, Joyce. It's still 1 syllable in English. And you can do that with many other words in English. And we have consonant clusters, etc., that Japanese never have, which is why when they borrow our word Christmas, 2 syllables, they put a vowel with every consonant. So it becomes karisumasu, karisumasu. So it's because of these differences, if you're writing 575 in English, and this is probably earth-shaking to some of you, if you are writing 575 syllables in English, you're actually violating the Japanese form, not preserving it. And that you can write shorter haiku to be of approximate weight of what is happening in Japanese. Because 100 yen does not equal $100. It's not the number that matters. The value of what you're counting is what matters more. And unfortunately, two things have happened because of this perspective on syllables and the way it's mistaught, and even in our textbooks in schools, is that it's put so much emphasis on purely counting syllables that you could write anything you wanted, and as long as it counts the syllables, it's a haiku. Well, no, because it's missed a whole bunch of other targets. Not even counting the fact that 17 syllables is the wrong thing to aim at compared to the sounds that are counted in Japanese. So for multiple reasons, 575 is problematic. And one of the problems that it produces is people will they'll add extra syllables that don't help the meaning, or they'll take off natural words just to make it fit. And they're privileging a count of sounds over meaning and clarity and smoothness. So all that being said, if you want to write 575, that's a choice. And it's how I wrote haiku for many years when I first learned haiku. It's a choice, but be aware that it's always going to be longer than the way a Japanese haiku will be. And that if you write 575, they might have to leave off details to make it fit in Japanese. If they were to translate it into Goshichigo, which is 575 sounds in Japanese. And the other thing to remember, if you do choose to write 575, is make sure you hit the other targets. And that's exactly what we're focusing on today. So again, it's a choice, but be aware of the possible compromises and be aware of other targets that you can aim at. And this all gets pretty technical. And the thing is, don't worry about it too much. Just write your experiences. Try to share your experiences so that the reader can have the same experience. Which reminds me, one of the best books I recommend for haiku in English is called The Haiku Handbook by William J. Higginson. And in the very first paragraph, he says, the purpose of haiku is to share them. And by sharing them, you sort of get a validation from somebody else, not of you as a person, but of your experience, or they feel a validation as well. They may not need validation at all, but when you see, I mean, the telephone ringing only once, we've all experienced that. And so it sort of reminds us that our experiences are human, and that we are human, and we are part of this this adventure of life together. That's really what the point of all that sharing is for, is to sort of say, to help us notice what is normal in life, and helps us celebrate even the little things to make the ordinary extraordinary. And I'm also thinking of there's a Japanese poet, Seisen Sui, who said, who referred to haiku as an unfinished poem. Not in the sense that it's inadequate or whatever, but that it is just a bit, just a part, and it's up to us to add the rest of the story to engage with the poem. The reader finishes the poem by thinking of emotion or idea, or picturing the story, or filling out the details. A haiku, perhaps more than any other kind of poetry, requires that sort of emotional engagement in order to finish the poem, because the poem is so slight. And if you're not counting 575 syllables and you're making it shorter, it's even slighter than most people think. So all of those things are good. I'm looking at the chat. There's Francie mentioned haiku is a one breath poem. That's a good way to talk about them. Somebody else, it's gone by. Somebody asked or mentioned, if I'm recalling the chat, that they like to write 575, and that again, that's a choice. Some people say they like the discipline of that, and there is some discipline to that. However, it's the easiest of haiku's disciplines. It's very clear to know when you've, I mean, not everyone agrees on what a syllable is, is fire one word, one syllable or two. So maybe that's tricky, but you know when you're done with your syllables. But that's much easier than knowing when you're done with some of the other targets, which we haven't even really dug into yet here. But those other things are actually a much deeper discipline. So if I know for a fact, for my experience, I wrote 575, and I also had titles, which haiku don't have. For 12 years, I wrote hundreds of 575 haiku, and I thought that was it. And then I encountered the second edition of Cor Vanden Heuvel's The Haiku Anthology from a major New York publisher, and I later counted something like almost 90% of the poems were not 575. And this was confronting to me. This is the first time I'd experienced this. And if that's what's happening for you today, it can be unsettling and puzzling, kind of like, what? I thought it was supposed to be 575. Well, in Japanese sounds 575 traditional, yes, but in English, not necessarily. And this anthology confronted me with this, and I began to understand that there were other targets that were more important than counting syllables. And a remarkable thing happened with my own poems is that instead of focusing on form, that book shifted my focus to focus on content and what I was saying, not the bucket I was trying to fill. And with that shift of focus, my haiku radically improved. And there are other targets too that we'll get to. So I'm not sure, that's a long answer for that question. Any reactions or comments on that question? Further questions?
I have one. Wondering, like, for the contest, how much does syllables count? Those kind of rules, do they not count, or is it?
Well, if you look at the examples there are examples from the previous years, you can see that there may be some 575 poems on there. Most are not, and what matters more is obviously the theme of cherry blossoms, but to get an emotional connection to the cherry blossom experience in some way. So some of the things the targets we're going to be talking more about today, they will matter more, not syllable counting.
Thank you.
So I'm seeing in the chat, if we ever enter a contest, how do we know we're being correct? Because I don't know Japanese. And below that, someone is saying short, long, short is a good pattern. Well, correct in Japan. Well, we're not writing Japanese haiku, so it's sort of undefined, slightly undefined as to what a haiku can be in another language. There is no direct parallel. If you write 575 syllables, it's too long compared to Japanese. So some people have proposed a 353 syllable pattern, but that's arbitrary to some degree. Some people have proposed a 232 beat, like just to count the accented syllables. And that's, both of those sort of match the idea of short, long, short in your lines, but how long is a line? How short is a line? It's kind of ambiguous. So there's not really an answer to say it's correct, at least in terms of form. However, there are established things to do with seasonal reference and that refrigerator effect, which we'll still dig into. So, so those things are actually more important than counting syllables or sounds. And you may never know if any particular poem is correct. And I've written thousands of them, and I don't know if they're correct, but I also don't care. Because what I'm trying to do is create an emotional effect with a clear image. And that when a reader reads it, if they see the same image and have the same experience or recognize the experience and have the same feeling, then that is what matters to me, not whether I'm being correct or not. And obviously, there are certain techniques that work better, and that's what I want to help promote with the rest of our workshop today. So, any other last minute comments on that subject?
Excuse me. I
Yes.
wanted to ask a question about the cherry blossoms.
Yes.
Now I see the picture behind you. They look quite pinkish, but I've been seeing images from Japan, and it seems that they look a lot whiter this year. Is that just my vision, or cherry blossoms sometimes more pink than white?
So good question. I'm not a horticulturalist, so I'm not quite sure, but I'm pretty sure the answer is that those are different types of cherry trees.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
the
right.
white, somebody who's more expert, maybe Karina knows a bit more about this, but I'm pretty sure there are Akibono cherry trees and other kinds, and they have
Oh.
different shades or colors.
Very
Great.
good, Michael.
Thank you.
Sorry?
Very good answer. The ones behind Michael are Akebono. They do come out a bit pinker. And in Vancouver, we have about 55 different cultivars and many more in Japan. So you'll see them in different shades of whites and pinks.
And if you go to the vcbf.ca site, there's a section that explains some of the different varieties and has pictures, so you can explore that. So yeah, good question. I was noticing there was some cherry trees near my house. There's some that were pink, and they're sort of fading now. There's another one the other direction that is white, and it's just completely full right now. And I wish I knew enough about which kind was which, because I wouldn't mind planting one on my front lawn, and I'd like to know what exactly is what. So someday I might figure that out. Okay, let's move on to another poem here. Somebody could read this. In this case, the poem is Flush Left. Somebody read this?
Distant thunder, the dog's toenails click against the linoleum by Gary Hotham.
Thank you. So, any comments, or how does this poem make you feel? Thoughts about this poem?
It sounds like my dog during a thunderstorm. Very, very fearful, pacing.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like that the twist is at the beginning, and yet there is a clear relationship between the two if dogs are scared of thunder, or they could have no relationship.
Okay, so it's open in that sense, but there is in either case, I think we can identify with the dog and its awareness of the thunder and perhaps fear of it. One detail that I like about this poem is that this is distant thunder, and yet this dog is still aware of it. If it said thunderclap, well, that would affect us too, very, directly, and would be no surprise for a dog to be startled and afraid by that.
If I could add, the distant thunder strikes me as being a sound, but it's so quiet where the dog is that we can hear him clicking against the linoleum.
Yes, and this is very much sound-based poem, so that it's really focusing on that particular sense. And when I've shared this poem in schools, some kids will say, "What's linoleum?" A kind of flooring, if you're not familiar, sort of a hard plastic flooring, very durable flooring. But yeah, you can hear the dog's toenails click against it for sure. Any other comments on this poem?
So I think the dog has been scared at one time by thunder, and he can feel it coming closer, perhaps from the distance to close up, and so he's already anxious.
Yes. Yeah. So we can identify or empathize with the dog, and it's being frightened.
Yeah.
And yet, all we're given, and you know how we might react to that. We may comfort the dog, we may pet it, we may feed it, or so, who knows. But all we're given is this moment when the dog's toenails click against the linoleum at the same time as the thunder happening, or perhaps immediately after. So we have just this moment that we're given, and yet we can imagine the before and after as well.
Click is onomatopoeic.
Yes. If you're not familiar with onomatopoeia, everyone, it's where the sound of the word sounds like what it's describing. So click has that sort of click sound to it. It's very short, sharp, quick sound. So yeah, that's a good point too. Move on to the next poem here. If somebody could read this.
Passport check, my shadow waits across the border by George Sweet.
So George Sweet is the co-founder of the Haiku Canada organization back in 1977. That's when it started. And he's one of the granddaddies of haiku in English, not just in Canada. And this is one of his most famous poems. How does it make you feel, anyone?
I'm touched.
Again?
I feel touched by this poem because for me it speaks of somebody who is coming back to his memory, to his own country. His shadow is, for me, it speaks of the past. I don't know. It's I find it beautiful, really.
Okay. And you're picturing that he's returning to his own country, but it could be that he's leaving to go to another country. But I like both possibilities.
It's because it's written, my shadow waits, like it's on the other border, on the other side of the border. So it means that there's something there from the past. I mean, for me, you know, it's all, I don't know.
So in the chat, Lynn said it's forward looking and hopeful, and Bonnie says it's a new start and an anticipation of the future. Jane is saying it's a slight fear. So it has all these emotions all at once, sort of this tension. Am I going to be let through the border? And yet the shadow indicates desire to go through the border and go to do something that is hopefully enjoyable. Sultan is posting the word immigration. So this idea of immigrating, not just traveling, but immigrating, a much grander change is part of the equation, I think. So lots of possibilities here of emotions. And obviously, when we've all been, I mean, if we travel, we've been through this sort of thing. And maybe not walking across the border, but at a border checkpoint in an airport or whatever, we have this feeling like once we're let through, then we're across the border, regardless of whether the border is actually at our feet or not. But this idea of the shadow waiting across the border sort of makes us visualize this moment of tension. So we're about to cross the border and be let in or let home, whatever the situation may be. Any other comments on this?
Yes, I had a question about the use of first person in haiku, because I had written some haiku where First person was discouraged. Like here's the word my. I used I, and I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Okay, good question. I think you've been given misinformation. One, I see no problem at all with using I and my in English haiku. Where I think that idea comes from to avoid it is because of a misunderstanding of how Japanese works. In Japanese, you could say passport check, shadow waits across the border. The syntax in Japanese would never need the word my because it's always implied. Many things are implied in Japanese syntax. For example, it could use a single word for shadow, but you wouldn't know whether it's shadows or shadow. The plural and singular is hidden. It's not clear, it's implied. Likewise, the actor, my or he or she, is implied, never and seldom stated. So people have interpreted that to mean you shouldn't have I in haiku in English. And I think that's a misunderstanding, and it's sort of trying to apply Japanese grammar and syntax rules to English. Because my understanding of the Japanese poems is that the my is completely understood. And then there are poems like Busan wrote about stepping on his dead wife's comb, autumn chill. I step on my dead wife's comb in the kitchen or where bedroom. I think it's the bedroom, obviously. And the fact that he is part of the poem is completely clear. And he's also referring to his wife, so another person. Some people think there should be no people in haiku. I think that's a misunderstanding. If there's humor about people or making fun of people, then it might be that variation of haiku called senryu, senryu, was mentioned earlier. But put that aside for the moment, because it's completely fine to have people in haiku and to refer to yourself in haiku. Something else that's been said about haiku is that you want to suppress the ego. But the way I interpret that is that doesn't mean you can't mention the self, because you could mention yourself just as ordinarily as you would mention a chair, and there's nothing wrong with that. What you want to be careful to avoid, and this is sort of an ego assertion, is my shadow waits tensely across the border, or my shadow waits with uncertainty across the border. As soon as you inject that judgment, then that's an ego assertion. And sometimes you can get away with a little bit of it. Generally, you want to back away from that. So just present the thing as its thing itself. And if you want to write down just one thing from this workshop, it would be this, and I think it connects to what I just said. Don't write about your feelings. Instead, write about what caused your feelings. And by doing that, you take out the ego, you take out the judgment and analysis. And a lot of beginner haiku will inject too much judgment and assessment of the image. And it weakens the power of the image. Here we have passport check. That's a context. You get it. We have that refrigerator effect. What does passport check have to do with the rest of the poem? Well, it's a border, so that's connection, obviously. But you have that grammatical shift that goes on. There's a sense of we have the passport check as a context, and then we have just the image itself. My shadow waits across the border. That's it. It doesn't tell you what to think about it. We automatically have feelings in reaction to it. And it's deliberately by withholding statement of feelings that it enables us to have those feelings ourselves. And that, to me, is one of the key tricks of haiku, if you want to call it a trick, is take out the most important thing, in this case, the feeling. Don't write about your feelings, write about what caused your feelings. Or as an extension of that, don't write about your ideas, write about what caused those ideas to come to mind. So you'll go a long way if you can apply that to your haiku. And as you write, especially if you're new to haiku, it helps to learn how to be aware of what is judgment and analysis, your mind intruding on things, back away from that and trust the image. And it's another way to put it is to learn how to control objectivity and subjectivity. I would say this particular poem, The Passport Check, and the other ones we've read, are essentially objective descriptions. There is no subjective interpretation. But by withholding that subjective interpretation, it empowers us as readers to have our subjective reactions. And thus we engage with it. We have the same feeling that the poet felt. And that's the secret of haiku, is by withholding that feeling, or the statement or judgment of the feeling, it allows us to have it. So it trusts the image. So, so in the chat, there's a question about using ing words to hide the subject. Instead of saying we talk about, how about saying talking? Well, sometimes that's okay. Some people say you shouldn't have ing words in haiku. And I disagree with that, because the chief motive to avoid having ing words is, I think, coming from this belief that you shouldn't mention the I or the self in haiku. And I disagree with that. So I think it's fine to say we talk about instead of talking. But it always depends on the poem. Sometimes it'll be better to have an ing word or not. So that's comes with experience, I think. But to say talking just out of a belief that you should not say we talk or I talk, I think is a misunderstanding of haiku, and a misunderstanding of how the Japanese syntax works and how it should apply or not apply to English. So that's my little soapbox on that. So let me move on to the next poem here. Somebody could read this, please. Somebody who hasn't read for us yet.
Okay, summer afternoon, the coolness of the newspaper from the grocery bag.
Jackie or others, why do you think the newspaper is cool?
Because it just came from the market.
Well, I think there's something more. There's more to why it's cool.
Oh.
I think it might.
Oh, okay.
I think it might be because it is next to items that are cold. Refrigerator or freezer items is one reason that it might be.
So in the chat, Caroline was saying it was next to the milk. Somebody else saying it has a fish in it. I like to think it was next to ice cream. But what this poem is about is actually heat. It's a summer afternoon, and he notices the coolness of the newspaper because it must be hot out, and because that newspaper would be next to something cool, presumably. Of course, this is my interpretation of the poem, the unfinished poem that I get to finish, and you get to finish. But I finish it by picturing ice cream, or it could be frozen peas, who knows? But it's really, to me, it's really about how hot it must be to notice the coolness of the newspaper. It feels unusual to notice the temperature of something like a newspaper. So I think the only reason that would be so noticeable is because it must be hot out. At least that's how I take it. Something else to know is Cor Vanden Heuvel is the editor of the Haiku anthology that I mentioned earlier, and he just celebrated his 90th birthday this month. And he has also published a book of baseball haiku and numerous other books that I highly recommend. He also lived for many years in New York City. So in this case, I imagine him going to the grocery store to get his groceries and his newspaper, since his newspaper might not be delivered directly to where he lived. So I picture that, and that's sort of information that comes from my knowing the author in this case. So let me move on to the next poem. I'll read this one. Spring breeze, the pull of her hand as we near the pet store. Let me ask a question. Those of you who have not seen this poem before, how old is the she in the poem? What do you picture?
Well,
She's
I
a
think
pretty
it's,
small girl.
yes.
Okay. And why do you picture a little kid? I'm seeing that in the chat a lot. One person says any age.
They love the pet store.
And she's pulling on the hand, so she's lower than the hand.
Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of people saying child. It's not necessarily clear. It's not necessarily certain. And since I wrote this, I can tell you what motivated it was my adult girlfriend wanting to go to a coffee shop in Palo Alto, California. And it was June. But what arrested me about the experience is normally I would walk faster than her. But in this case, I could feel the pull of her hand. She was wanting to go somewhere a little bit more quickly than me in this case. It was that pull of her hand that was the core experience here. And it felt energetic and youthful. So it felt natural to talk about a spring breeze instead of a summer wind or something. And instead of coffee shop, pet store, that eagerness felt like it went better with pet store. And I love the fact that most people picture a child in this poem because of the youthfulness of that. And I think that child idea, which doesn't necessarily come to everyone, but for those who get that image, I think that child character comes from the pet store and spring, and that's deliberate on my part. So those things suggest a child. And I love the fact that people go there with a poem, even though it doesn't necessarily say. One other thing I'll add here. Sorry, go ahead.
I also thought it could be an adult, but referring to the innocence and excitement of childhood.
Yes. Yeah, and it's open-ended enough that those meanings are completely welcome as far as I'm concerned. An update to this poem is that a few years ago, Washington State and Colorado and a few other places legalized a certain substance. So I published an updated version of the poem, Spring Breeze, the pull of her hand as we near the pot store, which I couldn't resist.
I think that COVID, COVID
No.
will probably bring about a lot of descriptive haiku and poetry.
Yes, there have been several pandemic haiku anthologies already.
May I do a comment?
Yes.
Yes, well, this haiku shows me what you meant when you said that it was a piece of a story, and there's a story before and the story after, and we feel it very much in this haiku. I like it very much.
So yes, and that brings to mind the playwright David Mamet, and perhaps others have said when you're doing screenwriting, he says, arrive late and leave early. when you present a scene in a TV show or movie, you arrive late, so you can imply what happened before, and you leave early to imply what's going to happen. And you see it all the time. Like I like to watch Law and Order, and a scene will say, they'll be interviewing somebody, and the person they're talking with will say, "Oh yeah, I know where the body is buried." They don't tell you, but the next scene they're digging, with shovels in a vacant lot. So obviously, what's implied in the cut between those two scenes is that the person they were talking with told them where to go. So that's a kind of compression that happens in movies all the time, and it's part of what happens in haiku. And I'll just toot haiku's horn here a bit. There was a Russian film theorist, who published a fundamental essay on film theory 100 years ago, where he said that film theory or film construction, remember 100 years ago, could benefit from understanding haiku. And he wrote how haiku has this effect of cutting from scene to scene that compresses and implies. And I think movies would have gotten there anyway, but it's nice to think that it got there more quickly because of haiku. And you can look that up if you're interested in film theory. All right, move along to the next poem here. Home for Christmas. My childhood desk drawer, empty. How does this make any of you feel, especially if we haven't heard from some of you yet?
Nostalgic.
Why?
Because it's a childhood desk,
Okay.
but it's empty.
Okay. Any other comments?
I guess my thought is whether or not it's a drawer that's empty. I think that's up for interpretation.
So since I wrote it, I can tell you, yes, I meant the drawer was empty, but the overtone is that it's not just the drawer that feels empty.
It feels like parents have repurposed this person's room.
Yep. That was exactly my experience. At least the desk drawer was still there. So in the chat, missing old things. Rutha said that. Lynn G says entering a new stage in life, leaving childhood behind, transition.
How about, sorry.
Go ahead.
How about you can't go home again?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I was about 23, 24 when I wrote this. And it was that moment of sort of realizing, well, I guess that's done with, isn't it? And I remember in the drawer noticing that there were crayon marks on the side of the wood inside, sort of a pine kind of light colored wood. And I remember seeing those crayon marks, but nothing else was there from my childhood. And it was sort of melancholy. And usually at Christmas, when if you celebrate Christmas, for most people, it's a happy and joyful time. And here's a moment of melancholy amid that happy time. And so it's perhaps a complex emotion going on here.
Michael, I want
very, very simple and immediate haiku for me to have written, and I'm grateful when they fall into your lap sometimes. Comment there? Someone
I
else?
just wanted to add that the point about Christmas makes it especially powerful because of the traditional aspect of Christmas and it being a time of family and fullness. Had you said home for spring break, it wouldn't be nearly as powerful because of the connotations associated with Christmas. It's really powerful.
Thank you. I'm glad it was Christmas when I was home when this happened then. It gave itself to me, so thank you.
Hi, Michael. I have a question.
Yes.
It's a very nice poetry, but I just wanted to know why did you place the desk drawer in the second line and not in the third line?
It felt like a more natural line break to me. If I said my childhood, that would be a noun on itself, if that were a line by itself. But I do mean childhood purely as a modifier of the desk drawer. I'm not talking about, I'm not emphasizing my childhood. I'm trying to focus on the desk drawer itself. So I think if my childhood were a line by itself, it would shift the meaning. That's my thought. And desk drawer empty would put less emphasis on the emptiness by itself in the last line. That's why I did it that way. And I think, you know, that these are choices we all make are on our own when we write haiku.
I would like to comment. It's a really powerful image because, as you said, you don't speak about nostalgic feeling or emptiness, but about the desk drawer. You put the context, you put the object, but the object, which is empty, talks a lot.
So thank you. This is the idea of don't write about your feelings, write about what caused them. I mean, that was a very physical thing of opening that desk drawer. I don't know what I was expecting to find inside, but on seeing the emptiness of the desk drawer, I felt an internal sort of nostalgia and emptiness as well, a longing. And yet just the thing itself was what I presented, and that's hopefully creating emotion in the reader.
Yeah.
Diana, you had a question?
Okay, so I wanted to comment. So I think it's kind of sad because the person like talks about a person that came home on Christmas and is already an adult, and so like he just looks at his childhood desk drawer and all of his memories that he had while studying and learning on this one. But maybe like he's the only one in the family, no one uses it anymore, and it just stands in his childhood room where he lived before he became an adult, and just memories just keep flooding in when he sees it.
That was certainly true for me. It was very rich with memory. And as I look at the poem now, I wonder what happened to that desk, because I know my parents got rid of it at some point, gave it away, sold it, I don't know. But it's gone now. And the funny thing that my two of my siblings had the exact same desk, so it might not have actually been my desk, but I think it was.
So when you went and saw the desk, had you had remembered leaving articles in the desk, and so it was shocking to find that it was empty. Is that right?
I don't remember specifically things left in the desk. And the other thing was that my parents had moved to a different house, so they had moved the desk to a new house. And I was visiting this new house. So for things to have been removed from the desk wouldn't have been a great surprise if they were moving all of our stuff to this new house. So that wasn't part of my feeling. But yeah, I think part of me, I don't know what I was expecting when I opened the drawer. It was just curious, what's in here? This is my desk. Then there's nothing there. So obviously the feelings that go with that.
Another comment on another level, it speaks about one fundamental principle in any religion, is that nothing is permanent. And for us, it's very, very, it's a thing very, which causes a lot of anxiety, but we have to cope with that nothing is permanent, as your experience.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And that's the religious aspect, or the religion aspect of that. It's perhaps implied by Christmas and multiple religions. It's a new addition to this poem. So thank you for that. And, yeah. And obviously this is my poem, so I'm pleased that it has this effect. But I think a good effect of any good haiku is that it has a certain amount of openness so that you can interpret it in multiple ways. And you want it to be somewhat open, but not too open so that it's confusing. So that's part of the art of haiku, is to imply something, but not too much. Restraint versus wildness, I guess, in the haiku. It's finding that balance is part of it. Let me move on to another poem here. I'll read this. Grocery shopping, pushing my cart faster through feminine protection. So this is an example of what was referred to earlier, the senryu, senryu, and some people will, I think it's mispronounced as senryu or senryu or something else. It's sort of a senryu, almost a D sound with the R, senryu. It's closer to how the Japanese pronounce it. And the idea, it's a variation of haiku, the same pattern in Japanese as a haiku, but with a different tone and a different focus. So I'm sharing that to show an alternative way you can write haiku. We'll talk more a bit about that later. So now I would like to shift gears and ask any of you to tell me which poems you like most or which poems you found puzzling out of the ones that we've just shared. Anyone?
Well, I really like the one about the dog and the thunder and his paws clicking, because when I was younger and we lived on the farm, when we heard distant thunder and we were trying to get the hay in, that just kind of made everybody start working a lot harder.
Yep. You got to be a farmer to relate to that, I guess, or to truly understand that. So in the chat, people are saying they like the passport check one, or the dog's toenails. The sparrows in the cold is a favorite. So one person said they thought the last one was puzzling. So I'll go back to that one. Any reactions to this? What does this mean for you? Anyone?
I think there is an abstractness in that, in the last line when we read through feminine protection. So I think it's not giving a clarity on the image.
So what is feminine protection? What does that mean to some of you?
Feminine products. So for me, it's discomfort.
Totally.
So tampons is what I'm talking about.
Yes. It's the guy going through the feminine protection section. Yeah.
I thought it was you had a wall of ladies with shopping carts in front of you.
No.
It's like the guy waiting in the lingerie section.
Yeah, so this is a guy poem. But yeah, I mean, I think it illustrates how this could be, the idiom of feminine protection could be culturally limited and not necessarily be clear in certain places. But it illustrates here how you're not necessarily going to click with all poems. And since I wrote this, I want you to connect with it. But I recognize that it's true. You will read a poem that somebody else thinks is really good, and you go, "What? I don't get that." And for various reasons, that's just the way it is. And I think of the Doritos slogan, "Eat all you want, crunch all you want, we'll make more." So that's the way I look at haiku. If one doesn't connect with you, read the next one. Or if you're writing them, and if it doesn't work very well, we'll write another one. And hopefully the next one will be better. And because the purpose of haiku is to share them, when you share them, some people will receive what you intended or are hinting at, and other people won't. That's okay. it's very subjective, and because of haiku being an unfinished poem, how much it requires the reader to finish the poem. It really relies on implication and how it's received. It's going to be received in different ways. So, as a writer of haiku, you have to sort of you want to control ambiguity so that it's not confusing to people, and you want to move the poem from private meaning to public clarity as best you can. But at some point, you let go, and it'll connect with people, or perhaps not connect in ways that are beyond your intent. And that's just the way haiku works. And it's because it's so short and so open to interpretation in a good way that it's going to sometimes lead to interpretations that are not what you meant, or perhaps different for you as a reader than for other readers. So
May I risk another interpretation?
yes.
It's because I had 4 boys, and for me, it it makes me remember my little guys pushing their cart through my feminine protection, you know?
Okay.
So it's really, really different, but I don't think you mean that.
Well, I do to some degree. I'm okay with that. It's at some point, I just wrote what came to me, what felt right for me, and how it's interpreted or received by others is fine too. So whichever direction you go with it, it works for me. I'm seeing in the chat, Karen wrote, "I like all of them. When I slow down as a reader, take time with each one, contemplate." I really like that thought, because I think that's what a haiku wants you to do. It wants you to slow down and notice things, to see the remarkable in the ordinary, or the extraordinary in the ordinary, to slow you down. I really like that thought. More comments. People like the telephone poem, the passport check. Bonnie is making a comment, just wait until I get to the depends aisle. And Valerie is asking, I thought we were going to do some writing. Yes, we are. So let me look at the clock here. Yes, let's move along here so we can get some writing exercise. But what I do want to do here briefly is, before we get to that, is thoughts on common characteristics. Let's spend a couple of minutes just identifying some common characteristics of haiku, if you could. Tell me, well, let me offer one. First of all, it's a poem. It's a short poem. And I think that's important to realize is actually significant. It's not a diary entry. It's not necessarily a mindfulness practice, although that's fine for some people. It is meant to be a poem. What are some of the other common characteristics you can think of?
Ego should be eliminated in the poem.
Okay, so that is a common characteristic. Okay, got it.
I think the language of haiku tends to show instead of tell. And I think that's nicely done in all the poems that we read. It's the descriptions are very detailed and also very immediate. It captures one specific moment that the poet experiences. I like the one about the pet store. That's that moment captured of the girl squeezing the hand of the person. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm looking at the chat. There are lots of additional thoughts. Some saying what you said, Jackie, and others as well. I've just pasted in a few. Simple, You fill in all the details, space to create a backstory causes you to think. They are spare. And on that notion of spareness, some people think haiku should be as short as possible. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think they should be as short as necessary, which means a long haiku could work and a really short haiku could work. But it's whatever is necessary to that particular poem. Image is important, creates emotions. These are all things that are part of what makes a haiku work. It's inviting readers, it engages readers. That's true.
Haiku should have a aha moment.
So yes, the aha, that feeling of realization, and I think that relates to what I referred to as the refrigerator effect. It's sort of unexpected, and in that poem it was funny, but in other poems it's sort of like, I get it, or yeah, I can relate to that. So definitely, yeah, an aha moment is part of that. The haiku moment, I think. Jimmy, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, well, I was also thinking about the shape. Like we had some where they're indented, so there's like a angle on the left. Your feminine one there was 5, 6, 7, so it's kind of an angle on the right. We had one that the third line was indented. I've seen some haiku that were one line in some other books and stuff. So how it looks on a page can be interesting, how we want to set it up.
Yeah, and that's it's worth mentioning that haiku in Japanese is actually a one-line poem written vertically. And some people say that in English, to be equivalent, all of our haiku should be one line horizontally. The translator Hiroaki Sato promotes that with all of his translations, for example. And there's a lot of one-line haiku in some of the haiku journals. The three-line part is very common, and all the examples I've shared here happen to be 3 lines. And that's the most common thing, and it relates to the 5-7-5 rhythm in Japanese, where it's in one line, but it has these segments, and those relate to the segments of the 3 lines that are common in Japanese.
I have a question.
Yes.
So haiku I read is a Zen moment. So Zen moment is usually the current moment. So can we write a haiku in past tense or future tense?
I think you could, but it's not going to work very well most of the time, because I think the present tense makes the poem more immediate and accessible. I've seen some poems that where part of the poem is in past tense, refer to something that was in the past, but it's presented in a now moment. So it's tricky. Future tense poems can be used like in science fiction haiku. There is a sci-fi haiku movement, a couple of haiku journals that focus on that, where it feels like it's in the future or about the future. But most of those actually still write in the present tense. They're about imagined future things like 2 suns in the sunset, but still presented as if it's happening now. So the present tense is by far the most common in haiku in English and in Japanese. You also mentioned Zen, and this is a common association of haiku. Many people think of haiku as a Zen art, and this is actually a uniquely Western concept of haiku. In Japan, they're puzzled when Westerners refer to haiku as a Zen art. And haiku is no more Zen than, say, a sonnet is Christian or Jewish. And yet, that idea of the moment and the sharp awareness of the moment that we associate with Zen is definitely true in haiku. And that's certainly something that appeals to me about haiku and Zen. So the connection is there. And there are many masters of haiku in Japan who had a Zen or Buddhist background. So it's there on occasion, but it's not really a Zen art. And yet everything is Zen, you could argue. But I I was once teaching a workshop, and the promotion for it years ago said, come and learn the Zen art of haiku. And I immediately asked them to change that because I don't teach it that way. And yet it can be Zen art, and it can be meditation practice or an awareness practice for people. There are many different stances you can take towards haiku. And if that's the one you want to take, that's fine. But I think a lot of people in Japan don't think of haiku as a Zen art. They're puzzled by this chiefly Western perspective of that, which comes from R.H. Blythe, who's a prominent translator about 60 or 70 years ago, where he just presented haiku as Zen. And the beat poets like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and so on also presented haiku as a Zen art. And that's where it comes from. And I think it's ultimately misleading or limiting. And yet it can be a Zen art. So it's got this sort of contradiction going on. Yeah.
May I ask
That was
something?
helpful. Thank you.
I would like to ask something.
Yes.
In the history of haiku, well, the first writer in the story of the haiku aren't part of the Zen Buddhist religion? The first one.
Basho is the most famous haiku poet in Japan, and he had Zen training, but he actually, I believe the story goes that his master said, you need to choose Zen or haiku. And he chose haiku. He chose haiku. I'm probably butchering that story, but he did not pursue rigorous Zen training. He left it. And Issa, another great master, he was a Pure Land Buddhist, which is not Zen, but definitely a Buddhist. And there were other, I mean, if you're writing any kind of poetry in the West, it's sort of influenced by the Judeo-Christian history. We cannot escape that. So you're going to have allusions and context that will inform the poetry. And so you get the same kind of thing in Japan, where you have Shinto and Buddhist influences. So it's not trying to escape that, but it's also not trying to be that. It's just the way it is. But I don't think it's necessarily. It's not a Zen poem in the way we might think it is in the West. We are running behind here, and I'm concerned about that. So let me move on here. This is some key haiku targets, some things to remember. Haiku is brief poetry of which form is just one part. And if it's not 5-7-5, it can be short, long, short. It can be one breath. For me, I take an organic approach to form, where I let the form arise out of the meaning that I want to convey. It uses objective sensory imagery, your 5 senses, that's important. And it uses a 2-part structure of juxtapositional structure. And somebody in the chat said they didn't understand the refrigerator effect. And I'd like to just talk about that briefly. In Japan, they have what is called a cutting word, or kireji. And it's like a spoken punctuation that divides the poem in 2 parts when it's used. It's not always used, but when it's used, it gives the poem 2 parts. So haiku in English, to be equivalent, should have 2 parts, not 3, but you want to have 2 grammatically separate parts that are put together. And you also, in addition to the grammar being separate, the 2 parts, usually want the image to be different. So there's a shift of the image as well. Not a restatement of the image, but a shift to the new image for the second part. And this is the refrigerator effect. You have one thing, the telephone rings only once, and then a leap, autumn rain. That's the refrigerator effect. What does that have to do with the other? And this is equivalent, more or less, to the use of a kireji Japanese haiku, where you cut the poem into 2 parts. And I'll go through it quickly, but I'll show you some examples in Japanese in a second. And the other major thing that a traditional Japanese haiku has is a seasonal reference called a kigo, or season word in Japanese. And some people think of haiku as a nature poem. And it can seem like that because so many of them have these seasonal references. But what they're aiming at is seasonality, not nature. In Japan, they have what are called a saijiki, which is an almanac of season words. It's not an almanac of nature words, because typically a quarter of the words have nothing at all to do with nature, but they are seasonal. Tanabata Festival is an example. It happens in July. Or Christmas could be one. It's seasonal, but not nature. And it's because of the way nature comes along for the ride most of the time that it looks like it's a nature poem, and some people call it a nature poem. Some people like the nature aspect of haiku. All those are good things. But what it really is aiming at is seasonality. So the kigo, kireji, or the equivalents in English, the five senses, and the implication of emotion, that's the last thing on the list. Those to me are the key targets for haiku. And if you go to my graceguts.com website, most of it is devoted to haiku, on the essays page or the further reading page, there is a link to haiku checklist, which identifies some of these key targets. Any quick questions on this? Because we do
Well,
need to...
it's more a comment. Thank you so much for these tips, because they are really, really clear. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Now I would like to, I'm going to skip this part, but haiku has a long history in Japan. It grew out of song, and it's haiku and tanka, which is a longer sort of poem than haiku, are still chanted today. There's more than we have time to get into here, but the word haiku itself was actually invented only about 120 years ago. So it's a fairly new term. But before that, haiku was part of a longer chain of linked verse and was collaborative. And it was only in the last 100 or so years that it began to be an independent verse form. Technically, some of the old masters that we know of from Japan did not write haiku because the term wasn't used then. But we've retroactively applied the word haiku. So very quickly, I'll go through some of the main masters of haiku in Japanese. Basho was the granddaddy of them all, the Shakespeare of haiku.
Yes.
Most famous haiku is Furuike ya Kauzu Tobukomu Mizu no Oto, or Old Pond, frog leaps into the sound of water, or leaps in the sound of water. There are many other translations of this. Frog is considered a spring seasonal reference, so it has that. The Old Pond I used an ellipsis to indicate the kireji, which is ya. So that's where the cut is in the poem. Old Pond, that's our context, and then the frog jumping into the pond. And the original version of this poem was just the frog jumping into the water. And Basho was with a bunch of students. He was saying he wasn't sure what to use as his first line, and somebody suggested a flower, and he rejected that and chose the Old Pond. And something that's interesting about the context here is that for centuries, if you wrote about a frog in traditional Japanese literature, you wrote about its croaking. Here, he was writing about the sound it makes as it plops into the pond. So it was very radical. And in a way, that frog was disturbing the old pond, the old way of doing things. So for me, there's an overtone to a metaphorical meaning to the old pond. And that's me reading into it. I don't know how many other people think that that's true, but that's one way that I interpret the poem, is that you're disrupting the old ways of doing things in traditional Japanese poetry. So Busan was the next great master. He was also skilled at haiga, which is haiku painting. You do a painting and use the same brush to write a haiku calligraphy onto the painting. And he was a master at this. Evening breeze, there's that ya, that cutting word, and there are many other, there's 18 different words that I think function as cutting words in Japanese. Kana is the most, another famous one. Evening breeze, ya, cutting word. ellipsis in this case. That's the context. Water laps the legs of the blue heron. So beautiful image and a very peaceful scene. It's very easy to see. Very pictorial too, which is no surprise since he was a painter. Isa's most loved haiku poet in Japan, perhaps, because he had such empathy for small things. And he wrote joyous poems despite terrible things happening to him, like his children dying, house burning down, his family kicking him out of the house, all sorts of problems that he went through. And this is perhaps my most favorite haiku in Japanese. Snow melting, the village is flooded with children. And the effect of the flooded, of being, well, what you mean is flooded with water, that effect in English is apparently the same in Japanese. We have the surprise that it's being flooded with children instead. And Shiki is the reformer of haiku. He coined the term haiku 120 years ago. Summer River, there's our seasonal reference, and ya again, all these examples happen to have the ya cutting word. Summer River clause. There's a bridge, but the horse goes through water. And that's because it's so hot out that even the horse wants to cool down by going through the water. And there's actually a fifth haiku master who is unfortunately neglected, Chioni. Morning glory, well bucket entangled, I asked for water. And again, we have that ya cutting word here, in this case indicated with the dash. Morning glory, plant, well bucket entangled, I asked for water, because she doesn't want to disturb what she sees as the beauty of the morning glory tangling the well bucket. So she goes somewhere else to ask for water. And the Asagao, morning glory, she's holding that in the picture here. Asagao. All right, so
I have a question.
yes.
So after the Kigo word, I see sometimes we use triple dots, or when we use a small dash or a long dash. What's the significance of those?
Okay, so punctuation in haiku is an option. Some people choose not to have any punctuation in their haiku. I choose to mark the cut with either an em dash or an ellipsis. And for me, an em dash sort of says this is happening at the same moment as this, so they're both at the same time. Whereas an ellipsis to me suggests a bit of slight passing of time, or that I want the reader to linger on the first image. Those are the two most common things. People will occasionally use other things like colon or semicolon. Semicolon feels too legal to me, but I never use it. But I wouldn't. I shouldn't say I would never ever use it. Depend on the poem. But I use the dash or an ellipsis. Some people will indent lines in place of punctuation. Like if you remember, the telephone rings only once, indent, autumn rain. And in a way that indent functions is an equivalent to, it's sort of setting that last line apart, just sort of like having a dash at the end of the line before. But again, it's a personal choice. And on my graceguts.com website, I have an essay on punctuation in haiku and another essay on capitalization and punctuation in haiku. And that piece is also on the vcbf.ca website. So yeah, good question.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yes.
Do they ever put that "ya" comment at the end, where like as a third line?
So usually the cutting word is inside the haiku, so you have one part and then the other. But there is also the case where, especially with the word kana, that can appear at the end of the poem. So it basically means the poem is a one-part haiku, ending with kana at the end.
No, sort of what I was meaning is if you've got two lines that belong together.
Yes.
So can you have the third part at the end rather than the beginning, like the one that jumps to a change of thought?
Right. So the parts can be in any order, either order. You could have one line and then two lines, or two lines and then one line.
Okay, fine.
That's what you mean. Yeah, either order. And then the third option is when the cutting word in Japanese is at the very end, you have a one-part poem. An example of that in English is an old woolen sweater taken yarn by yarn from the snowbank. Reads as one phrase. An old woolen sweater taken yarn by yarn from the snowbank. And this is my poem, so I can tell you it's actually not a winter poem, it's a spring poem, because birds are taking bits of yarn from a sweater to build a nest. And that's what I'm leaving out. And usually when a cutting word appears at the end, it's trying to imply something outside of the poem more strongly, I think. And to me, that's the intent. We're trying to suggest a bird building a nest, which isn't even mentioned in the poem. But if you get to leap to that, that's great. And you might not, and that's okay. Okay. On this page, you can see there's some background about haiku in Japan. I'll skip all that. But there's lots going on in Japan. And it's happening all around the world. I love this quote from Roland Barthes. He says, haiku has this rather phantasmagorical property that we always suppose we ourselves can write such things easily. They look really easy and simple, but to get there is not so easy, especially when you start thinking about two-part structure, the seasonal reference, the objectivity, five senses, and all of this can be overwhelming. And I would back off from that and just let yourself write, and just gradually you'll get there with some of those haiku targets we've mentioned. So we're way behind on schedule here. I am fine with going later than we're supposed to end in about 5 minutes here. I'm okay with going another half hour for anybody who wants to continue. But I understand if some of you have to leave. But I would like to encourage you. Well, one thing is write a cherry blossom haiku and enter it into the haiku invitational contest. Do that. And as a guide for that, go to the vcbf.ca site and look for past haiku. See some of the past winners or other honorable mentions or Sakura Award winners to get a sense of what's been done. One thing that a lot of people will do is that they'll write haiku about cherry blossoms looking like snow or confetti. And go ahead and write that if you want. Get it out of your system. It's been done thousands of times. And then try writing something else. I've written those poems myself too. And you'll see some on the website. But there are other ways to write haiku a little bit more freshly than thinking in terms of confetti or snow. But yeah, try writing a cherry blossom haiku. And obviously the cherry blossoms will be your kigo or season word. But here's the challenge that beyond that I'd like to suggest is think of your five senses, things you see or hear, smell, touch, or taste, and describe that experience, that taste, that something you touched or something you saw. Put us there having that experience. Again, don't write about your feelings, write about what caused your feelings. And if you write just one poem, it could be any sense. But if you want to stretch, try writing one for each of your five senses. And again, think in terms of 3 lines and this two-part structure, sometimes called the fragment and phrase, and a seasonal context. It's a lot to worry about. But if you start with an image like the shadow of cherry blossoms on the pavement, I'm making this up on the spot. There's 2 lines, the shadow of cherry blossoms on the pavement, meaning that the cherry blossoms haven't fallen yet, but there's just the shadow. So there I've got 2 lines. And then you have the challenge, okay, what do I put with that? That's the art of haikus. How do you create the juxtaposition? What's the right thing to put there? Now, you've already talked about shadow. You've already talked about the cherry blossoms, the tree, and the pavement. So your third line needs to not talk about that, but shift away to something else. That's the art of haiku. And I've been writing haiku for 30 or 40 years here, and that's still the hardest thing to do in haiku, figuring out what to juxtapose with an immediate image. So any questions on that?
I just want to verify something. When you are talking of the refrigerator effect, is the shifting effect? It's that?
Say that again, please.
I'm not sure that I really understand the word refrigerator effect. It's the shifting effect, you know, you put the context and then you shift to something that you
Yes.
don't expect. That's it?
Loosely, yes. It doesn't have to be a huge surprise. In other words, it could be a gentle shift.
Okay.
There should be some sort of change or shift. And it's both grammatical and imagistic. So the grammar, it means that the shift is independent. It's not a single sentence necessarily, unless you have a one-part haiku. But mostly it's a shift of image. So like if I have, you know, the shadow of cherry blossoms on the pavement, and then say divorce pending, that's a shift. And what does one have to do with the other? I mean, it may or may not work, but that's an example of that kind of shift, that refrigerator effect. Or
Okay.
whether it's humorous or not, it's trying to shift in some way.
Thank you.
So trying to catch up with chat here. If anybody has a question that I'm not seeing in chat, just speak up.
Michael,
Jenny?
I just wrote a haiku on cherry blossom. Can you comment on that? I mean, if that is right.
Could you type it into chat, perhaps?
Yes, I have typed. I can type it again.
Michael, it's Roberta here. I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but I just don't get the refrigerator thing. Could you explain it for the third time for those of us like me who are dense?
The opposite is true. I know you demonstrate it in your own haiku all the time. What I'm calling the refrigerator effect is based on a poem that I shared at the beginning of the workshop. Haikus are easy, but sometimes they don't make sense. Refrigerator, which to me is not a haiku. It's a comment about haiku. But the one thing it gets right is that leap to something unexpected. Refrigerator is also a clearly seen image. So the refrigerator effect in haiku is based on that poem, which is not even a haiku.
Okay.
But the effect of that surprising refrigerator last line is that it leaps away, and it's that leaping away that in the juxtaposition of two parts that is the real art of haiku. You know this. I've seen it in your
Yeah,
haiku.
I know it. I just didn't understand it in the context of that word, but I'll have to find is that on Gray Scott's? I'll have to look for your non haiku refrigerator poem.
It's I've written about it elsewhere. I don't know that I'm specifically writing about it in the way you're asking, but
okay.
I'm backing up to Amrutha's poem, Cherry Blossom, my daughter's first canvas painting. So Cherry Blossom, we have our season, so that's good. Cherry Blossom and then a dash, so we have a cut there. And the next two lines work as one unit, so that's good. My daughter's first canvas painting. Very clear images, so it's hitting that target really nicely. They're very objective. Have touches of subjectivity in a haiku if there's enough of the rest of the poem that's objective. But here, this is a purely objective haiku, I think. My daughter's first canvas painting. I like my because it creates relationship. Daughter is part of that. And then first canvas painting, or it could just say first painting. Either one could work. I love the word canvas. It has a nice sound to it. It's a rich word. But this idea of daughter doing a painting for the first time, is wonderful. But what really makes the poem work is the suggestion that it's the blossom that is inspiring this first painting. That's the real beauty of this poem to me, is that the blossoms are so beautiful that the daughter can't help herself but to do a painting of it. And
His
that's
daughter and her daughter is blossoming.
well, that too. Yes, thank you. I love that. Yeah, a good haiku has these little wonderful interpretations like that. So yeah, that's very nice. Does anybody else? Oh, I see Kristen has a poem too. Let's look at that one. Bare tree wears buds. So a dash to indicate our pause. Prettiest dress. Now, the bare tree wearing buds tells us that it's spring, that it looks mostly bare, but it's just beginning to bud. So I like that observation. Wears kind of humanizes the poem. So that's a bit subjective. And I'm okay with that, at least so far in the poem. But I would be a little careful with that. Sometimes it does work. So then we have a shift to prettiest dress. And part of me thinks that this is really a comment about the tree and the buds, and thus a metaphor. And that is perhaps subjective. And it's sort of telling us what to think. So we see this bare tree wearing buds. That's clear. But as soon as you say prettiest dress, you're judging it. You're applying a metaphor to it. And you're also talking about it again, rather than shifting away. Now, maybe that's just one way of interpreting it. I think it's not the word dress that's the issue, but the word prettiest, because it's sort of telling us what to think about it. It's a judgment word. Whereas if it said bare tree wears buds, comma, or dash, my daughter's new dress. So I'm borrowing my daughter from the previous poem here. But then we have an actual dress instead of a metaphorical dress. See the difference? And how it makes it more objective rather than subjective, more descriptive and imagistic rather than interpretive. And a good haiku tends to back away from the interpretation, analysis, and judgment. And that's what I'm seeing in prettiest dress. Bare tree wears buds, my daughter's new dress. Might be a way to address that issue. I don't know how you feel about that comment, those comments, Kristen.
Hey, do you have time for me to read you one?
I don't. First, Kristen. Maybe no comments, but I hope that's helpful to you. Let me be. I don't know who just spoke, but there are a couple of poems in the comments in the chat that I'd like to get through. Marcy Wessels writes, "New ducklings already swimming outside mother's week." So this is a one-part haiku, and I like that. And it flows very nicely. It has really nice line breaks, very clear images. New ducklings, we can totally see that. Already swimming. We don't know why already is relevant yet, but it becomes resolved in the last line. Outside mother's wake. So I love this idea that the ducklings are maturing. They don't need to stay close anymore, and that they can branch out and swim elsewhere. So the fact that they are already swimming outside mother's wake is sort of a joyful image. So I really like that one. Very nicely done. And for a one-part haiku, it reads very smoothly. If you did want to have two parts to it, though, it would need a different structure. But you don't have to do that. Even though I've talked about having two parts a lot, not every haiku has to have that. And obviously, the new duckling suggests a time of year as well. So it hits that target nicely. So lots of well-hit targets in that one. Okay, Sultan has one. Cherry blossoms. Professor's speech title, Eternal Existence. So we have the clear image of the cherry blossoms and the seasonal reference, and then a cut that indicated with the ellipsis. Professor's speech title. Now we have a colon, so we have another cut. I would back away from that. Just give your poems no more than one cut, one shift. Also, eternal existence is very much conceptual. It's a judgment. It's not an experience. I can't photograph that. Whereas I can photograph the cherry blossoms. So that to me is much more dwelling in the five senses. And the rest of it tends to back away from that. So I would simplify by giving the poem just two parts. What I do like about the poem is the contrast between eternity and the ephemerality of the cherry blossom. So that's what I think is the key thing about the poem. That's what I like most about it. Anna Yin, welcome, Anna. I know you're in Ontario. At a clinical's doorsteps, winding up a dandelion clock. Let me turn to the rest of you. What do you think of this poem, or what works for you in that poem? Anyone?
But can we see it on the
In the chat.
Yeah, because I don't see it.
You may have to scroll up a bit. I'm still trying to catch up. At a clinical's doorsteps, winding up a dandelion clock. Any comments on that one? So I pause a little bit on some of the syntax. Clinical is usually an adjective. Was the intent here at a clinics? Perhaps clinic was meant, and perhaps doorstep instead of doorsteps. So part of me immediately wants to say at a clinic's doorstep. And I don't know if that was your intent, Anna, but that comes to mind. Winding up, I think of clocks, winding a clock, but we haven't gotten to clock yet. So I'm wondering if the initial meaning is that you wind up the stairs as you go up the stairs to a clinic, perhaps. And then we have a dandelion clock. I'm not sure what a dandelion clock is, to be honest. So I would want to look that up. Maybe it's something I'm just not familiar with. You have a comment, Anna?
Unmute. Yes, okay, yeah, typo. For the clinic, it's typo.
Okay.
And yeah, and the dandelion clock actually is a part of like the dandelion flower. Like after the dandelion flower, they had like the umbrella that can fly. You can blow.
Yes, okay.
Each small part is the dandelion clock. So I use that clock has double meaning, like winding up also means dissolving. You know, it's like something finish or
Yes.
kind of. So I use double meaning. Yeah.
So I get that, yes. And I could look up, I'm sorry, I'm not able to do it right now, but yeah, I would immediately look up dandelion clock to better understand that. And thank you for that explanation.
Michael, it's Roberta here. It means I had to learn it too, because the HSA, I think we called one of the books dandelion clocks. It's for the anthology. It's when you make a wish on a dandelion, it's, when it's all puffy.
Yeah, it's a puppy, yeah.
That's a term that some people use for that kind of dandelion. So I also learned it a few years ago.
Oh, cool. Yes, and that's something I love about haiku is that there are often words that occur in it that are just perfect once you know what they mean, but sometimes you don't always know.
Right, exactly.
And you don't want too many strange words in haiku, but and it can be overdone, but the judicious use of occasional unusual words is a wonderful way to broaden your horizons. And I especially love words that are cultural. For example, Maori words from New Zealand can be wonderful, or pick your culture. And I wouldn't shy away from them, but you also have to use them very carefully. So whatever culturally specific words that are true for you, well, make the reader do a bit of work and look them up if they don't happen to know them. On the other hand, you want to be universal, but don't be afraid of being local and being true to what's true for you. And you know, the same thing could apply to, say, on the west coast of the United States, Haida or other First Nations terms could be wonderful to use if you are not appropriating. You have to be careful with such words. It's tricky. I'm behind on the comments here. I'm going to try and wrap up in the next 15 minutes, by the way. Let's go get to as many poems as we can. Joe Nelson has the bony cat sails on the balcony. Summer. And I love the detail that the cat is bony. That's completely unusual to me. And exhaling on the balcony.
Yeah.
I can see the cat exhaling on the balcony, that is sort of doing whatever it's doing, and it's like a sigh. And here it is, summer. So obviously we have the two-part structure and the turn or cut in the poem and the seasonal reference. And a note about the word summer. Naming the season is perhaps the easiest way to refer to this season. Whereas if you use something that's typical of that season, it might be a little bit more evocative. So what is something that can be used instead of the word summer to imply summer, typical of summer? So that's where, you know,
Sunlight.
well, sunlight could be any time of year, so maybe not quite that. Or you could use summer as a modifier. What if it said summer heat? Or summer clouds?
I like that.
But I would also consider finding something instead of the word summer that suggests summer without using the word summer. There's an opportunity there. And getting back to this idea of targets, the value of thinking in terms of targets rather than rules is that targets are opportunities, they're invitations, they're not restrictions. And certain things tend to work better than others, I think. But I love thinking about them as opportunity. And I see an opportunity here to add something that's summary in the poem without saying the word summer, I think. So, Jackie, you have a poem, Mass Shooting. Cherry blossoms fall collectively. So obviously, we just had another mass shooting in Indianapolis, I think, was it yesterday, in the United States, and so shameful and sad. So the idea of mass shooting is so much on our minds so often. And here it's cherry blossoms fall to me is very literal, but as soon as I get to the word collectively, the context of mass shooting, I suddenly think of all those lives lost being like cherry blossoms. I don't know if this is your intent, Jackie, but that's where I go with the poem. Does that feel right to you, Jackie, or did you intend something else? You're mute. Jackie, you're still muted.
Okay. Oh, here, I got it. Oh, okay, yes, that's what I meant. Thank you, Michael. I didn't know I was still muted. Yeah, that's basically what I meant when I wrote it.
Okay, well, thank you, and it's a very timely topical poem. And you have another poem, but in the interests of getting to other people, I'll skip your other poem, Jackie.
Oh, okay, I have another poem.
Yeah, I'll skip that one.
Cherry Blossoms.
No, I'll skip it for
Okay.
now because I want to get to other people.
Okay.
Okay, let's see. Caroline Keltis has spring rain, washes the grass, laundry hamper full. So spring rain, good seasonal reference, washes the grass. I mean, I think of, you know, how dry and dirty things can get over the long winter. Now spring rain is washing the grass, so that's nice. And then we go from that kind of washing to the laundry hamper being full, which is me a touch of amusement. It's a pleasing image there. We also go from outdoors to indoors. So we have to buy that as part of the poem. So it's sort of two places, one and then the other, unless we're seeing the rain out through a window, perhaps. But I'd be conscious of that in haiku. Does the whole thing stay in one place, or does it move? And is it one moment, or is it one moment and then another? And how far apart are those moments? If it's too far, perhaps it's less experiential. But in this case, we do have, I take the first part to be outdoors, and then we shift indoors. And I think it's okay because we can imagine seeing it out the window, or at least knowing that it's raining even while we're indoors. And I love the humor of the laundry hamper being full. Marutha, your poem, I stopped my car to capture cherry blossom. You have a dash before the third line. I don't think it's necessary because it really reads as one part. I stopped my car to capture cherry blossom. I might say blossoms, the plural. Or I would say a cherry blossom, which is probably not your intent. You just capture one. And capture has a nice overtone of, do you physically pick it up? Or are you photographing it? Could be
Photographing it.
those things.
Okay.
What do you think?
I was photographing it.
Sorry?
I was photographing it.
Ah, okay. So what do you think about saying to photograph cherry blossoms?
Sorry, what was your question? I missed it.
What about saying photograph instead of capture?
Yeah, because I was not just capturing it in the camera, it was captured in my mind also. So I used capture.
So leave it as capture. It suggests, I easily thought of photograph, so that's fine. So one thing the dash that you have there does not actually create a cut. And it feels like it's probably inaccurate to put the dash there, because to capture cherry blossom, it's a it's transitive verb. Is that the right term? So it has an object. Capture what? Well, the cherry blossom. So the dash, it feels incorrect there. So then I look at the whole structure. I stop my car to capture cherry blossoms. That feels like two lines, not three. And you still have thinking of opportunities here. I think you have an opportunity to add a new third line that leaps away. And going back to my divorce pending example, this won't work, but I stopped my car to capture cherry blossoms. Divorce pending. When that's such a leap, it's too far. It doesn't work. But think in terms of what else can you add that leaps away and that feels emotionally right. And that can be tricky. I'll try to move more quickly through some of the rest of these here. Safta Raza posts this one. Cherry blossom walks through pink feathers. Phone calls with mom. So part of me immediately wants to say one phone call, not multiple phone calls, to make it more immediate, more here and now. Multiple phone calls spreads out the moment too much, and it's very easy to just change calls to call to sharpen the poem. Pink feathers. Were you going to say something, Safter?
No, I was just saying thanks. That's good advice.
Okay. So the pet feathers, do you mean the blossoms by the word feathers?
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to create like an image of softness through, yeah,
Okay.
like the cherry blossoms. I was thinking of like stepping on sort of like the fallen cherry blossom petals. Yeah.
So I like that. I like that idea, but feathers as a literal meaning means bird feathers. So you don't mean that, you mean it sort of as a metaphor. And I would try to stay away from a lot of metaphor in haiku. So as you're describing it, you talk about stepping on them. There's a phrase you use and it's gone. But the idea of just stepping on cherry blossoms to me is enough. You don't need if they're blossoms, they're probably white or pink, so you don't need to say pink. And the metaphor of feathers diffuses things, and it's clear enough without that, I think. So the idea of a long walk through the cherry blossoms, a phone call with mom. That's the poem for me. And you don't need the pink feathers at all. And sharpening it to one call, I think is lovely. I can easily imagine you describing the cherry blossoms as you're walking along with the phone in your hand. Of course, part of me says, put down that phone and look at the cherry blossoms. But I know we do both of these things at once very often. Okay. All right. So any other comments or sharings that anybody wants to offer?
I have a comment.
Yes.
It's my first seminar at my life on haiku, and I must thank you very much because you made it very, very clear. It's a beautiful haiku, and surely I will try. I will try. I don't know if I will success, but I will try.
Well, thank you. And I will say that it's a percentage game. And when I quoted the Doritos slogan, crunch all you want, we'll make more. Well, that's your responsibility. You have to keep making more. And with practice, that practice helps. If you set yourself a goal, say to write one haiku a day for a week, see how that goes. Whether they're about different of the five senses or not. Try writing one haiku a day for a week. Then maybe for a whole month. And one thing that's happened for me with writing haiku regularly is that it changed my awareness. I began to notice when things happen. And I specifically remember noticing that the plum bloomed before the cherry blossom on the street where I lived in California years ago. And that was I haiku to thank me for paying attention to that. Some people are better at paying attention to nature than I am, so that's nothing special. But for me, it was a way of being more aware of the subtleties of seasonal change. And something else that was even better than that was it made me more aware of my emotions and feelings and reaction to those experiences. And there's a quote from Harold G. Henderson. He wrote a book called An Introduction to Haiku in 1958. And it was an expansion of a 1934 book called The Bamboo Broom. And there's one sentence in that 1934 book that he omitted when he did the later book. And I wish he'd kept it. But he was talking about Basho's frog poem. And he said there had to be external silence for him to notice the sound of the frog. But there also had to be internal silence for him to be aware of it. And it's that idea of cultivating an internal and an external and an internal silence so that you can hear and feel and experience things that comes with the practice of haiku. And that to me is the joy of it. And then the next step, of course, is you share it. And if you find a haiku group or a haiku invitational contest to share your poems at, or you know, there's lots of haiku journals out there. All these ways are to share it are a wonderful extension of the habit of haiku. And going further, Randy Brooks, who runs a haiku college program in the Midwest, he talks of blessing haiku. That if somebody tells you they enjoy a haiku, they've just granted a blessing on it. And if your poem is accepted for publication or chosen in a contest, it has received a blessing. So there are many ways of receiving a blessing as a writer of haiku. But of course, the reader of haiku is blessed by the poem too. And that's part of why the virtue of sharing haiku is so wonderful. And the haiku community, if you're new to haiku, you may not know that I know a handful of people in the meeting here, and I know them from different parts of the world. And that's because I know their work, or if I don't know them personally, because of how wonderfully close and connected the haiku community can be. It can be very addictive too. So watch out. But there are lots of haiku journals, and Haiku Canada, and the Haiku Society of America, or the British Haiku Society, or New Zealand, or other countries. And, lots of opportunities in Japan, of course. And multiple languages. There are haiku organizations all over Europe, for example. And they all publish journals. This is all a wonderful thing to be part of. And so when William Higginson says the purpose of haiku is to share them, well, it's because of that mutual blessing, that community, the social aspect of haiku. That is, it's a wonderful component that moves haiku beyond just poetry. It's community and sharing and all of that. So I hope that's an invitation to all of you to pursue the haiku habit and to share your haiku. And of course, please do enter the Haiku Invitational. I think there's some, the next slide here is share your haiku. It fits in exactly with what I was just saying. All the different ways you can share your haiku. You can do them artistically. You know, put a type of haiku on a photograph, or make artwork and share it that way on Facebook or whatever. Or read them to people, or go up to strangers in the supermarket and flick the haiku on them if you dare. I don't know. There are lots of ways to share haiku. But here, to summarize, 3 short lines of about 10 to 17 syllables. The fragment and phrase idea, right in present tense is a good thing. So these are haiku targets. Usually haiku have no titles, tend not to use rhyme, tend to avoid judgment, analysis, and metaphor and simile. On the other hand, for every rule, you can break it. So sometimes it works. It's good to write from personal experience, but that doesn't mean something that just happened. It could be writing from a memory from a long time ago. And I like to say it's not the recency of the memory that matters, it's the vibrancy of the memory. And everything is written from memory anyway, even if it was a second ago. On a practical note, the word haiku is both singular and plural, so there's no need to say haikus like that refrigerator poem did at the beginning of our session today. And again, finally, don't write about your feelings, but about what caused your feelings. So there are other haiku-related arts. I'll skip that. But I will invite you to enter the Haiku Invitational, and the links have been pasted into the chat as well. VCBF.ca, where you can read past winners and commentary from past judges. Also, interviews that I've been able to do with past winners. There are 6 top winners every year. And I've done interviews with each of them for the past 4 or 5 years, and that's an interesting view into their haiku practice. And I love their answers to the moment they first heard that they won. Those stories are wonderful to hear. Perhaps I can interview you if you win one of the top awards this year's contest. And the entries are due by June 1. So on that note, you can become a haiku addict. the Haiku Anthology or William Higginson's A Haiku Handbook, and there are many other books out there. And I hope you'll all get the haiku habit and share your haiku. And with that, we have come to an end. And I will invite any last comments from anybody. If anybody wants to share in the chat or voice, please do.
So, Michael, it's late night here, and it was all worth it. Thank you so much for the session and your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What time is it there?
It's 1 o'clock.
In the morning?
No, night. It's India.
Well, thank you for staying up late.
It was worth it. Thank you.
Any other comments, last comments or questions?
No, just thank you for a great workshop.
So what I want to know is what are you all going to do with it? I want you to get that haiku habit.
Well, you did succeed for that.
Okay, well, we will bring this session to a close then. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't get to more writing sooner, but please do take the opportunity to write a few haiku today, and maybe at least one haiku a day for the week ahead if you give that a try.
It's like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, and haiku a day keeps I don't know, the doctor away.
Yes. And thank you also to the Vancouver Cherry Blossom Festival for hosting this, promoting it, and thank you to Karina for orchestrating this and just making this happen. And thank you to Linda Poole and Leaf Wheeler for sponsoring this. We are so fortunate to have all the support to make this possible for everyone. And I'm very grateful to all of you for attending. So thank you, everyone. And on that note, I will say thank you all and good afternoon, or whatever the time zone is where you live.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.